My wife was secretly corresponding with her lover. One day I found out about it and decided to replace the letter to teach her a lesson. It all began on a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind where you can hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustling of leaves outside. Life felt ordinary, predictable even, which is why the discovery hit me like a freight train. I was organizing the drawer in our home office, her drawer, a place I rarely touched because Alicia always had a knack for keeping it meticulously arranged. But that day, I was searching for a specific receipt, one she'd casually mentioned misplacing. My fingers brushed over envelopes, notes, and old paperwork until I found something that didn't belong. A letter. Not just any letter, but one addressed to someone named Ethan. The neat handwriting was unmistakably hers. My breath hitched as my eyes darted to the words at the top. It wasn't sealed, but I hesitated. This wasn't mine to read. Or was it? After all, it was sitting in our shared space. Against my better judgment, I unfolded the paper, and with each sentence, my stomach twisted. Her words spilled out like confessions to a diary. You make me feel alive in a way I thought I'd lost. When I'm with you, the world disappears. Every word was like a dagger, cutting through my perception of what our marriage was. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was deliberate, calculated. But what stung most wasn't just her betrayal. It was her effort to preserve something so intimate, not for me, but for someone else. Yet, instead of confronting her right away, an idea rooted itself in my mind. What if I didn't confront her? What if I took this letter and rewrote it? That night, I barely slept. The letter sat in my pocket like a burning coal, its words seared into my memory. Alicia slept soundly beside me, her soft breathing a mockery of my turmoil. Every now and then, I glanced over at her, wondering how she could carry on like nothing had happened. Did she even feel guilty? By morning, I had made my decision. Confrontation was too easy, too immediate. It wouldn't give me the closure I needed. I wanted something more, strategic. The letter wasn't just a weapon. It was an opportunity. If she could craft her little fantasy world with Ethan, then maybe I could craft one of my own. While Alicia showered, I sat at the kitchen table, her letter spread out in front of me. I ran my fingers over the paper, tracing the loops of her handwriting. The pain was still fresh, but now it was joined by a new feeling, determination. With a fresh piece of paper and a pen, I began to rewrite her letter. Line by line, I morphed her words into something else entirely. I didn't just alter the message. I twisted it into a mirror she wouldn't be able to avoid. The tone was still affectionate, the words still her style, but the underlying message would be impossible for Ethan, or anyone, to misunderstand. Instead of gushing about how Ethan made her feel alive, I added sentences about fleeting passions and shallow connections. I made her sound distant, almost cold, as if Ethan were a distraction from something deeper. I dropped hints that she was feeling conflicted, even guilty. By the time I finished, it was a masterpiece. Not just a letter, but a subtle trap. Alicia came into the kitchen as I tucked the rewritten letter back into her drawer. She was dressed for work, her hair still damp, and she greeted me with a kiss on the cheek. The casual normalcy of her actions made my stomach churn. "Everything okay?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Her voice was light, almost cheerful. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about work." She nodded, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. As she left for the day, I stood by the window, watching her car disappear down the street. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. The letter was back in its place, waiting for her to find it. And when she did, she'd have no idea the words weren't hers. The rest of the day was a blur. I busied myself with errands, anything to distract from the knot tightening in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. When would she notice? Would she confront me? Or would she rush to Ethan, unknowingly delivering my carefully crafted words? By the time Alicia returned home that evening, I had composed myself. She breezed through the door with her usual energy, greeting me with a smile and a quick kiss. I studied her, trying to detect any sign that she'd found the letter. But she was as composed as ever. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "Exhausting," she sighed, slipping off her shoes. "I'm going to change and start dinner." She disappeared into the bedroom, and I followed her movements like a hawk. Any minute now, she'd open that drawer. I could almost hear the rustle of paper, the sharp intake of breath when she read what I'd written. But dinner came and went without a word. We sat across from each other at the table, chatting about mundane things. Her work, my errands, the neighbor's new dog. My heart pounded every time she glanced my way, but her expression betrayed nothing. Had she not looked? Or was she playing her own game? The suspense was maddening. After dinner, she curled up on the couch with a book while I pretended to watch TV. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she hadn't found it yet. Maybe she was saving it for later, savoring the drama of her secret correspondence. Or worse, maybe she'd found it, realized it was altered, and was testing me. It wasn't until the following morning that I got my answer. She was rushing out the door for work, her usual whirlwind of grabbing keys and double-checking her bag. I stood in the kitchen, sipping my coffee, trying to appear nonchalant. "Bye, Han," she said, kissing me on the cheek. "Love you." "Love you too," I replied, my voice steady. Then it happened. As she opened the door, her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at the screen, her lips pressing into a thin line. Her expression darkened, and she quickly swiped the notification away, almost as if she didn't want me to see it. My pulse quickened. Ethan had read the letter. The door shut behind her, and I set my coffee down, my hands trembling. The game had officially begun. I spent the rest of the morning pacing the living room, my mind racing with possibilities. What had Ethan said to her? Had my rewritten letter planted the seeds of doubt I intended? Or had it backfired entirely? The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't resist any longer. I picked up Alicia's laptop, which she had carelessly left open on the kitchen counter, and logged into her email. My fingers hovered over the keys, a mixture of guilt and resolve bubbling inside me. I hated invading her privacy, but then again, she had shattered the sanctity of our marriage first. I searched for any recent exchanges with Ethan. My heart pounded as I clicked on the first email thread, and there it was, his reply to the altered letter. The message started with confusion. "Alicia, I don't understand. Is this some kind of test? Last week, you told me how deeply you felt for me, and now you're talking about fleeting passions and guilt? What changed?" A satisfied smirk crept across my face. He was rattled. The email went on, his tone shifting from confusion to desperation. "If you're having second thoughts, I need to know. I can't be left in the dark like this. Please, meet me tonight so we can talk." My chest tightened as I read the closing lines. He had asked her to meet him at a bar downtown, a place I recognized from one of her girls' nights out. The irony was almost laughable. When Alicia returned home later that evening, I could feel the tension radiating off her. She tried to play it cool, chatting about her day, but her movements were hurried, jittery. She barely touched her dinner and kept glancing at her phone. "Something on your mind?" I asked casually, hiding my growing suspicion behind a calm exterior. "No, just a lot going on at work," she replied too quickly, her eyes darting away. I nodded, not pressing further. I wanted her to think she was still in control. She excused herself early, claiming she was tired, but I knew better. She wasn't heading to bed. She was getting ready to meet Ethan. As soon as I heard the front door close behind her, I grabbed my keys and followed. My heart pounded as I kept a safe distance, my car blending into the night traffic. She parked near the bar, her posture stiff as she stepped out and glanced around. I parked a block away and waited, my grip on the steering wheel tightening as the minutes ticked by. And then I saw him, Ethan. He approached her with urgency, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. They stepped inside together, and my chest burned with equal parts fury and exhilaration. This was it. The trap was about to spring. Sitting in my car, parked just outside the bar, I could feel my pulse racing. My mind ran through a dozen different scenarios of what was happening inside. Was she confessing her supposed doubts? Was he trying to reassure her? Or were they throwing caution to the wind and deepening their betrayal? I couldn't just sit there. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I debated my next move. Walking in, storming up to them, and causing a scene crossed my mind. But no, that wasn't my style. If this was going to work, I needed to stay calm and calculated. Instead, I decided to get closer. I parked the car further down the street, slipped out, and made my way to the side of the building. The bar had large windows with heavy drapes, but a small gap between them allowed me a partial view inside. I stood in the shadows, peering in just enough to see them seated in a corner booth, their heads close together. Alicia looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with her phone on the table. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed agitated, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. Even from a distance, I could feel the tension between them. Whatever was being said, it wasn't the intimate, romantic exchange they'd likely imagined when they planned this meeting. Ethan leaned forward, his brow furrowed as he spoke intensely. Alicia shook her head, her face pale and drawn. She looked unsure. Her usual confidence seemed to have evaporated. For a brief moment, a pang of something unexpected hit me. Was it guilt? Regret? No, I quickly buried it. This was her doing. And then, the unexpected happened. Ethan reached across the table and grabbed her hand. It wasn't a loving gesture. It was firm, almost pleading. Alicia pulled her hand back sharply, her lips moving quickly as if she were trying to explain something. Ethan's face contorted into anger, and he sat back, crossing his arms. I couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear. Whatever fantasy they had built was crumbling. The letter had done its job. After a few more tense moments, Alicia stood abruptly, grabbing her purse and shaking her head. Ethan reached for her again, but she stepped back, her movements sharp and decisive. She turned on her heel and marched toward the door. My heart skipped as I ducked into the shadows, pressing myself against the brick wall. She stormed out of the bar, her face tight with frustration. She glanced up and down the street, clearly debating what to do next, before heading toward her car. I waited a few moments, my breathing shallow, and then stepped back into view. Through the window, I saw Ethan still sitting there, slumped over the table, running his hands through his hair. Victory tasted bittersweet. I slipped back into my car, watching Alicia drive away. Her taillights disappeared into the distance, and I was left with the image of Ethan sitting alone, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world had just settled on him. For the first time in weeks, I felt a semblance of control. But this wasn't over, not yet. Instead of heading home, I decided to stay for a while. There was one more piece of the puzzle I wanted to understand. I parked further down the street and waited, keeping an eye on the bar. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, Ethan emerged, his movements heavy and slow. He lit a cigarette, staring blankly into the night, before pulling out his phone. I felt my stomach tighten as he raised the phone to his ear. Was he calling her? Or someone else? I couldn't hear the conversation, but his gestures told a story of frustration and anger. He paced back and forth, running his hand through his hair. Then, after what felt like an eternity, He shoved the phone into his pocket and walked to his car. I followed at a safe distance, my curiosity burning hotter with each mile. Where was he going? I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe a retreat to his own home. Or perhaps he'd stop somewhere to clear his head. But as we drove further into the quiet suburbs, I realized he wasn't going home. He was going to her. Alicia's car was parked in our driveway, her silhouette visible through the curtains of the living room window. She was pacing, her phone in her hand, clearly on edge. Ethan pulled up across the street, parking under a dim streetlight. He hesitated for a moment before stepping out, his posture stiff with purpose. My breath caught. What was his plan? Did he think he could salvage this mess? Did he think showing up at her home, the home we shared, would endear him to her further? My grip on the steering wheel tightened, my knuckles white. This was no longer a game. This was a direct invasion of my life. But instead of heading toward the house, Ethan stopped. He stood there, staring at the glowing windows, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might march up to the door and demand answers. But then, as if a switch flipped, he turned sharply on his heel, got back into his car, and sped off into the night. I sat there, stunned. Something about the scene felt hollow. His bravado had vanished, leaving behind a man who seemed more defeated than determined. I waited a few more minutes, ensuring he wasn't coming back, then quietly pulled into the driveway. As I stepped into the house, Alicia turned to me, startled. "You're home late," she said, her voice tight. Her eyes darted toward her phone, then back to me. "Got caught up," I replied, shrugging as if nothing was amiss. "You okay? You look frazzled." She shook her head quickly. "No, I'm fine. Just a stressful day at work." Her lie was so effortless, so seamless, that I almost laughed. But instead, I simply nodded and moved toward the kitchen. Inside, I felt the weight of everything settling in. The letter had done its job, the cracks were showing, and now it was only a matter of time before the facade came crashing down. The next morning, I woke early, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. Alicia seemed quieter than usual, her usual morning chatter replaced by a stiff silence. She avoided my gaze as she sipped her coffee, her phone sitting untouched on the counter. It was almost like she was afraid of what might pop up on the screen. "You sure you're okay?" I asked, trying to sound concerned but not pushy. "Yeah, just tired," she said with a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. She quickly finished her coffee and excused herself, saying she had an early meeting. I watched her leave, the weight of her guilt practically trailing behind her. As soon as she was out the door, I grabbed her phone. It was a risky move, but I couldn't resist. I unlocked it using the password I'd memorized months ago and dove straight into her messages. There it was, the thread with Ethan. My heart raced as I read through the exchange. After their meeting at the bar, Ethan had sent a flurry of messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Alicia, please, you can't just walk away like this." What changed? Was it something I said? Something I did? And then, the one that hit me hardest. I thought we had something real. I thought I meant more to you than just a distraction. Her response was short and clinical. "I can't do this anymore, Ethan. It's over." The finality of her words surprised me. Was she genuinely ending things? Or was this just damage control? Either way, Ethan wasn't taking it well. His last message read, "You're making a mistake. Call me when you realize it." I locked the phone and set it back on the counter, my mind spinning. On one hand, it seemed like the letter had accomplished what I wanted. It had driven a wedge between them. On the other hand, her sudden decision to end things with Ethan felt too abrupt, too convenient. Was she really cutting ties, or was this just a performance to buy herself time? That evening, I decided to test her. Over dinner, I brought up the idea of a weekend getaway, just the two of us. It's been a while since we've had some quality time together, I said, keeping my tone light. Maybe we could head to the mountains or the coast? She hesitated, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. That sounds nice, she said finally, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. Great, I said, smiling. I'll start looking at options. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. She was distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. I wondered if she was thinking about Ethan, about their ruined plans, or about how to navigate the mess she'd created. As I lay in bed that night, I realized something. The real test wasn't the letter, or the texts, or even her reaction to Ethan. The real test was coming, and I was ready. The weekend arrived faster than I expected. I had booked a cabin in the mountains, a secluded spot with no cell service and nothing but nature around us. It was the perfect setting, not just for a romantic getaway, but for answers. Alicia seemed hesitant as we packed. Her movements were slower, her demeanor distracted. "You sure this is a good idea?" she asked, folding a sweater and placing it into her bag. "Why wouldn't it be?" I replied, keeping my tone casual. "We've both been stressed. A change of scenery will do us good." She didn't argue, but I caught the flicker of something in her eyes. Doubt, maybe fear. Either way, I didn't push. I wanted her to come willingly, to feel like she still had control. The drive was quiet. Alicia stared out the window most of the way, occasionally making small talk about the weather or the scenery. I kept the conversation light, letting her fill the silence when she wanted to. But in the back of my mind, I was counting down the moments until we arrived. The cabin was everything I'd hoped for. Cozy, isolated, and far enough from civilization that we'd have no interruptions. As we unloaded the car, Alicia seemed to relax a little, her shoulders easing as she took in the view of the surrounding trees. "This is nice," she said softly, almost to herself. "See? Told you," I replied with a smile. "This is exactly what we needed." We spent the afternoon hiking a nearby trail, the crisp mountain air filling our lungs. Alicia seemed to enjoy herself, laughing a little more freely and even holding my hand as we walked. For a moment, I almost believed we could go back to the way things were. Almost. That evening, as we sat by the fireplace sipping wine, I decided it was time. The moment felt perfect, intimate, unguarded. "Alicia," I began, my voice steady but gentle. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up from her glass, her smile fading slightly. "Of course. Are you happy?" I asked, watching her carefully. "With us, I mean." The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "Why would you ask that?" "I don't know," I said with a shrug, trying to sound nonchalant. "You've seemed distant lately. I just want to make sure we're okay." Her eyes darted away, focusing on the flickering flames in the fireplace. "I've just been stressed," she said after a long pause. "Work has been overwhelming, and I guess I've been taking it out on you." "I'm sorry." Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for this conversation, but I wasn't about to let her off that easily. "I get that," I said, leaning forward slightly, "but it feels like more than just stress. Like there's something you're not telling me." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "What are you saying?" I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch between us. "I'm saying I want the truth, Alicia. About everything." Her breath hitched, and I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she set her glass down and stood abruptly. I need some air," she said, heading for the door. I watched her go, my chest tightening. The cracks were widening. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The door clicked shut behind her, and I stayed seated, watching the fire dance in the dimly lit room. The silence she left behind was heavy, almost suffocating. I waited a few moments before grabbing my coat and stepping outside. The cool mountain air hit me like a wave, refreshing but sharp. Alicia was standing near the edge of the deck, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding against more than just the chill. She didn't hear me approach at first, and I took a second to observe her. Her posture was tense, her shoulders drawn up, and her head tilted downward. It was the look of someone grappling with a storm of thoughts. "Alicia," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned quickly, her expression a mixture of surprise and something else. Guilt, maybe fear. "I just needed to clear my head," she said, her voice shaky. "I know," I replied, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "I'm not trying to corner you. I just want to talk." Her lips parted as if to argue, but she hesitated and nodded instead. "Okay." I leaned against the wooden railing, giving her space. "I don't want us to keep pretending everything's fine if it's not. I can handle the truth, Alicia, whatever it is." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, her eyes focusing on the trees beyond the deck. The moonlight highlighted the conflict on her face as she struggled to find the right words. For a moment, I thought she might actually tell me everything, lay it all out, and finally give me the answers I'd been waiting for. But when she spoke, her voice was faint, almost resigned. "It's not what you think." I raised an eyebrow. "Then tell me what it is." She hesitated, biting her lip. "I've been feeling disconnected. From everything. From us, from myself. I don't know how to explain it." Her words were vague, evasive, and they only fueled my frustration. "Disconnected how?" I pressed, keeping my tone calm. "Because it seems like there's something, or someone, you're not telling me about." Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide. "What do you mean?" I sighed, deciding to lay my cards on the table. "I'm not blind, Alicia. I know about Ethan." The air between us froze. Her face drained of color, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But instead, she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping. "How long?" she whispered. "How long have I known? Or how long have you been seeing him?" I countered, my voice sharper than I intended. Her eyes welled up, and she looked away again, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." I let her words hang in the air, waiting for her to continue. She hugged herself tighter, as if trying to hold herself together. "It started as just talking," she admitted finally, her voice trembling. "I was feeling so alone, and he made me feel heard. I didn't mean for it to go so far." "And yet it did," I said, my tone cold. "It wasn't just talking, Alicia. You wrote him letters. You met him. You planned a whole life behind my back." She flinched at my words, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something close to pity. But it wasn't enough to outweigh the anger simmering inside me. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't even know why I let it happen." I shook my head, stepping back from her. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Do you even know what you're sorry for? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" Her silence spoke volumes. I turned and walked back inside, leaving her standing on the deck alone. The weight of her confession hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. There was still more to uncover, more to confront, and I wasn't done. The rest of the night passed in a tense, uneasy silence. Alicia eventually came back inside, her eyes red and puffy, but she said nothing. She went straight to the bedroom, and I stayed in the living room, staring into the dying embers of the fire. I replayed her words over and over in my mind. It wasn't supposed to be like this. What did that even mean? Was it regret? Or was she mourning the version of herself that she could no longer hide? The questions gnawed at me, but I knew I couldn't force the answers out of her. Not yet. The next morning, she was already up when I woke. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into her coffee, as though it might offer her some sort of guidance. She barely acknowledged me as I poured myself a cup and sat across from her. "We should talk," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "Yeah," I replied. "We should." She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. There was a mix of exhaustion and desperation in her gaze. I ended it with Ethan. Her words hit me like a stone sinking in water. "When?" "After the letter," she admitted, her voice trembling. I thought it would make things clear, but instead, it just made me realize how far I'd let things go. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "And what exactly did you realize?" "That I didn't want to lose you," she said, her voice cracking. "I was stupid, reckless, and I let myself believe that what I had with him meant something. But it didn't. It was a distraction, and it never could have compared to what we have." Her words might have sounded sincere to someone else, but to me, they felt hollow. "You don't get to decide that now," I said, my voice calm but icy. "You don't get to weigh your options after betraying me." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want to try. Please, let me try." I stared at her for a long moment, my thoughts a whirlwind of anger, pain, and something I couldn't quite define. She was asking for a chance, but after everything, could I even consider it? "I don't know if I can," I said finally, my voice steady. "You broke something, Alicia, and I'm not sure it can be fixed." She flinched, but nodded slowly. "I understand." For the rest of the weekend, we stayed in the cabin, existing in a strange limbo. She tried to act normal, cooking, suggesting a hike, even trying to joke, but the weight of everything hung between us like a storm cloud. I could tell she was trying, but it didn't change the fact that I wasn't ready to let go of my anger or my plan. The drive home was quiet, but my mind was far from still. I'd made a decision, one I knew I couldn't take back. Alicia might have ended things with Ethan, but she hadn't escaped the consequences of her actions, and I wasn't going to let her. That night, as she slept, I opened her laptop again. I pulled up the letter I'd rewritten and added a final touch, an email draft addressed to Ethan's work account. Attached were screenshots of her messages to him, along with the damning photos I'd found weeks ago. I didn't hit send. Not yet. But knowing it was there, ready and waiting, gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. For now, I'd wait. Alicia thought she'd taken control of the situation, but she had no idea that the story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. In the days that followed, Alicia and I existed in an uneasy truce. She was overly accommodating, making my favorite meals, cleaning without being asked, and trying desperately to patch things up. But every gesture felt performative, as if she believed that kindness alone could erase what she'd done. I played along, for a while. I wanted her to feel safe, to think she was earning my trust back. But inside, the storm still raged. The rewritten letter, the email draft. It all lingered in the back of my mind, a quiet reminder that I still held the power. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Alicia finally broke the silence. "I know you don't trust me yet," she said softly, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Therapy, counseling, anything." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw her as she truly was. Not just the woman who betrayed me, but someone who had let herself believe in an illusion. She was clinging to me now because her fantasy had crumbled, and I was all she had left. And that's when I realized something. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't about punishing her or exposing Ethan. It was about reclaiming my life, the life she had tried to steal from me with her lies. The next morning, I opened her laptop one last time. My fingers hovered over the mouse, the email draft staring back at me. The screenshots, the messages, the evidence. It was all there, a weapon ready to be unleashed. But as I stared at it, a strange calm washed over me. I didn't need to send it. I didn't need to stoop to her level to prove my worth. I was done letting her choices dictate my actions. Instead, I closed the laptop and began packing my things. Alicia came home to find me zipping up a suitcase, her face pale with confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I'm leaving," I said simply, my tone steady. "I can't do this anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for me, but I stepped back. "Please," she whispered. "Don't do this. I can fix this. We can fix this." "No, Alicia," I said firmly. "You can't. And honestly, I don't want you to. I deserve better than living in the shadow of your mistakes." She broke down, sobbing, but I didn't let it sway me. I grabbed my suitcase, my keys, and walked out the door without looking back. As I drove away, a strange sense of relief settled over me. For the first time in months, I felt free, not just from Alicia's betrayal, but from the anger and bitterness that had consumed me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. It wouldn't include her. And as the city faded into the rearview mirror, I allowed myself a small, genuine smile. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something better. For me, and for the life I was finally ready to reclaim.